There are people alive today who can describe, with equal clarity, the sound of a dial-up modem connecting and the sensation of holding a smartphone for the first time. Not as historical curiosities, as lived memories from the same lifetime. If you were born somewhere in that narrow corridor between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, you occupy a position in generational history that researchers are still working to fully articulate. You're not quite Gen X, you're not quite a millennial. And the more sociologists try to force the fit, the more obvious it becomes that something genuinely distinct happened to the people born in that window. Researchers have used different names for this group over the years. Xennials, the Oregon Trail generation, a microgeneration. The labels vary, but the underlying observation stays the same. Something about that particular slice of time produced a psychological profile that doesn't map cleanly onto either neighboring cohort. And understanding why requires looking carefully at what actually happened during those years, not in broad strokes, but in the specific texture of daily life. Your childhood existed in a world governed by physical presence. Information didn't travel instantaneously. If you wanted to know something, you either already knew it, asked someone who did, or went looking for a book. Waiting wasn't a design flaw in the system. It was the system. You waited for the weekend to watch a specific film. You waited by the phone. You waited in lines without anything in your pocket to distract you from the fact that you were waiting. And somewhere in all of that waiting, something was being built in you. A tolerance for discomfort, a capacity for sustained attention, a relationship with time that was fundamentally different from what would come later. Then the architecture of daily life changed, not through gradual drift, but through something closer to rupture. The internet arrived, then email, then mobile phones, then social platforms, one after another in rapid succession. And the crucial detail, the thing that makes the Xennial experience psychologically interesting, is that this rupture happened right at the threshold of adulthood. You were old enough to have formed real memories and habits in the analog world, young enough that your brain was still in a high adaptability phase when the digital world arrived. Neuroscience has something useful to say here. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most responsible for complex learning, decision-making, and adapting to novel environments, continues developing well into a person's mid-20s. For Xennials, this meant that the most neurologically flexible years of your life coincided almost exactly with one of the most dramatic technological transitions in human history. You didn't just observe the shift, you absorbed it while your brain was still forming its deepest patterns. This created something unusual, a kind of cognitive bilingualism. You can read a paper map and you can navigate with GPS. You remember what it meant to be genuinely unreachable, hours passing with no one able to contact you, and that being entirely normal. But you also adapted to constant connectivity, without the anxiety that sometimes grips people who made that transition later in life. You speak both languages without an accent in either one. The social implications run deeper than most people acknowledge. Growing up before the documentation of everything meant that your embarrassing moments, your bad years, your experimental phases had somewhere to go. They could fade. Memory, as researchers in cognitive psychology have long understood, is not a recording device. It is a reconstructive process. The brain keeps what it finds meaningful and quietly lets the rest dissolve. That is not a flaw. It is a feature. It allows experience to become wisdom rather than evidence. For Xennials, that process could operate the way it was designed to. There were no permanent records competing with the brain's natural editing. Your past was yours to interpret, to narrate, to gradually transform into something you could learn from, rather than something that followed you around unchanged. But then there is the other edge of the story, because arriving at early adulthood in that particular window meant something else too. It meant walking into the job market in the years surrounding the 2008 financial collapse. The timing was not incidental. Research on economic trauma consistently shows that financial instability experienced during the years when people are first trying to establish themselves, first jobs, first apartments, first attempts at building something stable, leaves marks that outlast the circumstances themselves. The anxiety doesn't simply lift when the economy recovers. It becomes part of how you think about security, about planning, about how much you trust in forward momentum. Xennials learned to adapt to technological upheaval, but many of them simultaneously learned that the ground could disappear from underneath a carefully constructed life with very little warning. This combination doesn't get discussed much. The cultural conversation about generations tends to operate at a level of abstraction that flattens these kinds of specificities. Gen X is painted with certain broad strokes, Millennials with others. The space between them gets treated as a rounding error rather than as a location with its own distinct characteristics. But the experience of living through a major transition during your formative years creates a psychological orientation that simply doesn't fit neatly into the frameworks built around generations that experienced more stability in their defining period. What tends to emerge from that experience is a particular kind of flexibility, not the flexibility of someone who has never been attached to anything, but the flexibility of someone who was attached to one way of living and then had to learn, without much preparation, how to be attached to a completely different one. That is harder. It requires something, and the people who did it carry the result of having done it, even if they can't always name what they're carrying. There's also something worth examining in how Xennials tend to relate to the concept of nostalgia. Gen X has a particular relationship with the analog past, a genuine mourning for something that was lost. Younger Millennials and the generations following them have largely never known what was lost, so there's nothing concrete to miss. But Xennials sit in a strange middle position. You remember the before clearly enough to be specific about it. You also remember adapting to the after and finding real value in it. So the nostalgia, when it comes, is more complicated. It's not idealization. It's more like a nuanced accounting of a trade. You know what was gained. You also know, with some precision, what was given up. Presence, for one thing. The particular quality of attention that exists when there is simply nothing else competing for it. Patience. Real patience, not the performed kind, that develops when systems don't respond instantly. A certain quality of solitude that's difficult to achieve when connection is always a few seconds away, and its absence starts to feel like an error in the environment rather than a natural state. What was gained is harder to argue with. Access, connection, the collapse of certain kinds of distance, possibilities that were genuinely unimaginable to your younger self. The exchange happened. You made it, and you understand it in both directions. That dual understanding may be the most durable thing the Xennial experience produced, not a superiority. There is no hierarchy in generational timing, only different circumstances and different lessons, but a specific kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what it looks like when an entire world reorganizes around new principles, and what it costs and what it offers, and how a person finds their footing in the middle of that reorganization without losing the thread of who they were before it started. That knowledge doesn't belong to a label or a demographic bracket. It belongs to the experience of having lived through something and having come out the other side still recognizably yourself.